His name was Aurangzeb. And more than 5 centuries later, historians still cannot fully agree on what he truly was. That disagreement itself tells us something important, not everything, but enough to understand that his legacy remains deeply contested. Because most rulers of history, over time, settle into clearer categories. We broadly understand figures like Julius Caesar or Genghis Khan. But Aurangzeb, the 6th of the great Mughal emperors, continues to resist any simple definition. Different historians interpret him in different ways. Some have described him as a ruler whose policies reflected increasing religious conservatism. Others argue he was a pragmatic strategist managing an empire under immense political and military pressure. Scholars such as Audrey Trushka, Satish Chandra, and Jadunath Sarkar have all approached his reign differently, sometimes reaching very different conclusions. The historical record itself is contradictory, and any attempt to reduce it to a simple narrative does not hold up under scrutiny. Tonight, we are not here to resolve that debate. We are here to look at something else entirely, what this era of continuous warfare meant for the women who lived through it. Women who held no political power. Who commanded no armies. And whose lives were shaped by decisions made far beyond their control. And what some of those women chose to do when their world began to collapse. First, the man himself. Because the complexity of this story requires it. Aurangzeb came to power in 1658 after one of the bloodiest succession struggles in Mughal history. He defeated his brothers in a brutal civil war, imprisoned his own father Shah Jahan in Agra fort, and declared himself emperor. Shah Jahan would spend his final years confined, looking across the river at the Taj Mahal, the monument he had built for his wife, visible but forever out of reach. Aurangzeb was, by most accounts, disciplined and personally austere in ways that surprised even his critics. Contemporary records suggest he earned his personal expenses by sewing prayer caps and copying the Quran by hand, choosing not to draw from the imperial treasury for private use. He appears to have been genuinely devout. He was also capable of extraordinary political ruthlessness. Whether his religious policies were driven primarily by faith, political calculation, or a combination of both is still debated. What is clearly documented, however, is that certain policies shifted away from the broader inclusivity seen under earlier rulers such as Akbar. In 1679, Aurangzeb reimposed the jizya, a tax on non-Muslim subjects that Akbar had abolished more than a century earlier. This is a well-established historical fact. There are also documented cases of temple destructions during his reign, including at Kashi Vishwanath Temple and the Krishna Janmabhoomi site in Mathura. In some cases, historians suggest these actions were linked not only to religious policy but also to political rebellion or resistance in those regions. At the same time, the broader picture remains complex. Many Hindu temples continued to function across the empire. Hindu elites, particularly Rajputs, continued to serve in high-ranking positions within the Mughal administration. The proportion of Hindu officials did not collapse in the way a simplified narrative might suggest. Aurangzeb also issued land grants to certain Hindu institutions. The record does not resolve neatly. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: elements of religious discrimination did intensify during his reign. And combined with decades of nearly constant warfare, these policies contributed to widespread instability and suffering, especially among those with the least power. People without armies. Without protection. People like the women whose stories we now turn to. Because Aurangzeb was, above almost everything else, a ruler defined by war. His campaign stretched across much of the Indian subcontinent. He fought prolonged conflicts with Rajput states such as Marwar and Mur. He conquered the Deccan sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda. And he spent the final 25 years of his life in the Deccan, locked in a grinding conflict with the Marathas, first under Shivaji, and later his son Sambhaji. These wars consumed enormous resources and never produced the decisive victory he sought. In conflicts of this era, whether in South Asia, Europe, or the Ottoman world, civilian populations often bore the consequences in ways official histories tend to understate. Women in contested regions faced risks that varied depending on circumstances, including the nature of the conflict, the conduct of individual commanders, and the breakdown of order during sieges. There are historical accounts, including court records and eyewitness testimonies, that describe instances of women being taken during military campaigns. These accounts exist and cannot be dismissed. What remains uncertain, and debated, is the scale and consistency of such incidents. Some historians argue they were systematic in certain contexts. Others maintain they were not official policy and occurred irregularly, sometimes in violation of Mughal legal norms, which theoretically prohibited harm to non-combatants. The evidence does not allow a single, definitive conclusion. But one thing is less disputed: the fear. A documented, recurring fear of what defeat could mean. And it is that fear, shaped over centuries, not by one ruler alone, that contributed to one of the most haunting practices in recorded history. It is called Jauhar. And before describing it, precision matters. Jauhar did not originate in Aurangzeb's time. It predates the Mughal Empire by centuries. One of the most well-known early instances is associated with the siege of Chittagong in 1303 during the expansion of Alauddin Khilji. Multiple instances are recorded across different centuries, under different rulers and political contexts. What historians observe as a pattern: Jauhar appears in accounts of sieges where defeat was imminent and where women believed capture could result in enslavement, coercion, or loss of social status. It is notably less associated with conflicts between groups that shared similar martial codes regarding treatment of non-combatants. There is no clear evidence that the practice increased specifically under Aurangzeb. It is better understood as part of a longer historical pattern shaped by repeated cycles of warfare. The practice itself, as described in historical and later narrative sources, was this. When a fort could no longer be defended, women within, from royalty to commoners, gathered together. They dressed in ceremonial attire, often associated with weddings. Rituals were performed. And a massive fire was prepared. They entered it together. At the same time, the remaining men would prepare for what was called Saka, donning saffron robes and riding out to fight a final battle they did not expect to survive. The acts were interconnected. One inside the walls. One outside. Modern historians approach Jauhar with differing interpretations. Some frame it as an act of resistance. Others as a tragic consequence of extreme social pressures and limited choices. The idea of honor attached to it must be understood within its historical and cultural context, not imposed uncritically from a modern perspective. What is not debated is the desperation that gave rise to it. One example sometimes associated with this broader pattern is the 1634 siege of Bundela in central India. However, the historical record here is fragmentary. Accounts suggest that Jauhar took place when the fort fell. There are also references to captives and forced conversions in some narratives. But the details, numbers, sequence of events, and specific outcomes, vary significantly across sources. Because of this, historians treat these accounts cautiously. The event is recognized as a site of conflict and loss, but not all details can be confirmed with certainty. Now, the story of Hadi Rani. And here, full clarity is essential. Hadi Rani is not a firmly documented historical figure in the same sense as Aurangzeb or Shah Jahan. Her story survives primarily in Rajput oral traditions, in ballads, folk songs, and regional storytelling. According to these traditions, she was a newly married queen whose husband was called to war shortly after their wedding. Distracted by thoughts of her, he reportedly asked for a token to carry with him. In the story, she sent him her severed head, a symbolic act meant to remind him of his duty above all else. This story has been told and retold for generations. It reflects values deeply embedded in the martial culture of its time: duty, sacrifice, and the subordination of personal attachment to collective obligation. But whether the event occurred exactly as described, or at all, cannot be established definitively. It is best understood as a powerful legend emerging from a real historical environment shaped by war and uncertainty. In 1679, Aurangzeb moved to annex the kingdom of Marwar following the death of its ruler. He attempted to assert control over the succession, including the custody of the infant heir Ajit Singh. This triggered a prolonged and significant rebellion led by Rajput forces under Durgadas Rathore. The conflict expanded, drawing in neighboring regions. In a striking development, Aurangzeb's own son, Prince Akbar, joined the rebellion, accusing his father of betraying established political understandings. Aurangzeb responded with a calculated political maneuver, circulating a forged letter that undermined trust between Akbar and his allies. The alliance fractured. Prince Akbar fled, eventually leaving the subcontinent. He never returned and died in exile. Meanwhile, in the Deccan, the Maratha conflict intensified. Aurangzeb captured Bijapur in 1686 and Golconda in 1687. In 1689, he captured Sambhaji and ordered his execution, an act intended to decisively weaken Maratha resistance. It did not. Instead, the Marathas adapted. They shifted to decentralized guerrilla warfare, operating across vast terrain, avoiding direct confrontation. They could not be easily defeated, and they could not be controlled. Aurangzeb spent the last decades of his life in military camps, far from the imperial center, as resources drained and administrative control weakened. Near the end of his life, he wrote letters that historians continue to study. In them, he expressed fatigue, uncertainty, and reflection. One line, often cited, reads, "I came alone and I go as a stranger. I do not know who I am, nor what I have been doing." Whether this reflects a deep personal reckoning or a conventional expression of humility remains debated. But the words themselves are part of the historical record. He died in 1707, at the age of 88. After his death, the Mughal Empire began to fragment. His long wars had strained its resources. Certain policies had weakened key alliances. His prolonged absence from the imperial center had administrative consequences. But the empire's decline cannot be attributed to him alone. His successors struggled for power. Regional forces, including the Marathas, Rajputs, and Sikhs, expanded. And European trading companies, including the British East India Company, increased their influence, positioning themselves within a rapidly changing political landscape. The collapse was not caused by a single factor. It was the result of multiple pressures converging over time. And at the end of all of this, beyond emperors, wars, and political strategies, remain the people who lived through it. Especially the women. Not as symbols. Not as legends. But as individuals whose lives were shaped by forces they did not control. Their stories survive in fragments, in records, in oral traditions, in contested accounts. Not all details can be verified. But the fear they experienced is consistently documented. The choices they made, whether in recorded acts like Jauhar or in quieter, unrecorded ways, were made under conditions most people today will never face. The past does not offer simple answers. But it does leave us with something real, human lives shaped by conflict, uncertainty, and impossible decisions. And that, at least, is not in dispute. If this story made you think, share it. Because history, told with its contradictions intact, is far more powerful than any simplified version. Subscribe to Throne Unknown. We don't tell you what to think. We show you what we know, and where the uncertainties remain.